Namaste. Welcome to Citti Media. This is our current affairs program. My name is Abhishek Naipathy, and I will be your host today. Today, our topic is going to be about the latest research paper conducted by the Network Contingent Research Institute. The title of the paper is Cyber Social Swarming Precedes Real-World Riots in Leicester: How Social Media Became a Weapon for Violence. To talk about this topic today, I have two very special guests, and I'm about to bring them on right now. Welcome to the show, Prasiddha Ji and Parth Ji. Namaste.
Namaste. Thank you for having us.
Namaste.
Thank you for coming. So let's get into the topic real quick. Describe to us what exactly you do at the NCRI.
Sure. So I'm Prasiddha. Thank you again for having us for the second time now to discuss another NCRI report. I'm a intelligence and data analyst at the Network Contingent Research Institute, and I'm also a graduate student at Carnegie Mellon University.
And my name is Parth. So I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow at the European University Institute in Florence in Italy. My background is in economics. I did my PhD in economics from Princeton before doing this postdoc. And I've been president of Hindu Students Council, which is why, these issues of public importance to the Hindu community and to all other communities is important to me and how I got involved with NCRI's research.
Thank you for sharing that. So the last time you guys were on, we talked about your previous paper, which you talked about the trends of Hindu phobia online. And I guess as you were continuing that research, the events in Leicester had come up. So can you kind of describe what kind of motivated you to sort of focus on this issue? Did you feel that you needed to prioritize this over some of your other research?
Sure, yeah. So back when we came on in July, we weren't expecting that we'd be on a few months later talking about Leicester, because this wasn't something that was expected. This is something that definitely fomented on social media, and you see it escalate into real-time riots. I think that what really caught our attention was the usage of social media in instigating the violence, let's say, versus other instances where social media may not have played such a big factor. Parth and I are involved in several other projects, but this is something that did catch our attention and felt that we needed to investigate what really took place here using computational methods to understand the usage of social media in instigating this violence.
And Partji, would you like to share something?
Yeah, I think when there's a real world event like this that happens that is so important, and specifically within the diasporic community, and when you see that social media, after our first paper, when we were on with you before, Abhishek, that first paper, which was really about how the spread of Hindu-phobic tropes and really the spread of tropes against any community can have the potential for real-world violence, right? At that point, it was potential. In the intervening months, we saw many incidents of actual Hindu-phobic violence, not just in the UK, but also in Canada, in the US, and in other places within the diaspora. And I really think that Leicester was a culmination point and something that we felt that it was important to bring out. It also helps highlight that the research that we did previously was in fact, in some sense, predictive. It was kind of heralding that these types of tropes and these types of narratives will eventually lead to violence, and sadly, unfortunately, they did at Leicester.
It is kind of unfortunate that, in a way, that you had to be proven right in such a way. But it is, I guess it does show that the importance of doing the work that you do. So one of the things you covered in the paper was you gave a breakdown of the timeline of events. So can you kind of break that down real quick? I think you wanted to share your screen.
Yeah, definitely. So we can go through a timeline of events that the NCRI developed. All of this was collected using open source intelligence. So it is important to note that we did find from other research groups that noted that there was tension between two communities that went way before the cricket match. But since the focus of our research is on social media, misinformation, disinformation, and malicious narratives, this is what our focus begins after the cricket match. So India and Pakistan played the cricket match on August 28th. And we see from a video that Indian cricket fans gathered in the Belgrave area of Leicester to celebrate India's win over Pakistan in the Asia Cup series. And on August 29th, there was a Twitter user with username Tragic Bud that basically disseminated the first malicious narrative that went viral. So this had over 2,037 retweets and quote tweets, And this video shared by Tragic Bud accumulated close to 305,000 views. So you see that Tragic Bud basically posts this video to show Indian cricket fans chanting "Death to Pakistan." As if it wasn't enough in India, now we've got these Nazi lovers in the UK disrupting the harmony between different communities. And you see that this is the first malicious narrative that comes about. The idea that these chants of Pakistan Murdabad being chanted by Indian cricket fans is now a part of a larger Hindutva conspiracy. So anyone who knows about cricket matches, the history of cricket matches, and especially in the UK where all kinds of sports become rowdy and lead to real-time violence and clashes between various fans of different groups, this is now turned into something that is a part of Hindutva. So this basically was the first malicious narrative that spread, and what the NCRI did is we developed a social graph of this first tweet, and actually it is to be noted that both this account and this original tweet have since been deleted on Twitter, but using open source intelligence tools like using the web archive, for instance, we were able to actually recover all of these deleted tweets that don't get covered in media and other places that talk about this. So you see that this first narrative, this very large node represents Tragic Bud, and these other nodes are basically all of the users that replied to Tragic Bud. So you see that Islamophobia Response Unit, this big node of Satyam, this user, and Tell Mama UK, where both the Islamophobia Response Unit and Tell Mama UK basically responded saying that we are looking into this incident, while this user Satyam said we should cancel Indians' visas and send them back to India, and that's how they'll learn their lesson. So this was the first malicious narrative, that this was part of Hindutva and it was like religiously motivated. Then you see this amplification of the video by Tragic Bud by Majid Freeman, basically saying that, look, we know that this was about Hindutva, and in the same area, ripped up Quran pages were found on the streets not far from the same road. So you see that he basically insinuates that Hindus also ripped up Quran pages while there's no evidence to corroborate either of those claims. So once this was amplified, these tweets also got engagements in the thousands. Once this amplification by Majid Freeman, you see that there was a series of deleted tweets from British Pakistani accounts, which portrayed Hindus as a dangerous threat in need of a response. So basically saying Hindus in the UK, especially Leicester, need to chill out. You do not want smoke from the Muslims in the UK. This ain't India, bruv. And you see Gustavo Khanage, which is this British comedian Guz Khan, who has hundreds of thousands of followers, said, after these pro-Modi weirdos attacked Muslim and Sikh brothers in Leicester, I heard the Mandem are on a madness to sort them out. So for those of you not familiar with British slang, Mandem is basically like slang for like gang. So you see how, again, this is instigating violence and suggesting that people are going to sort out, if you're in this video, good luck. And then this user called Halifax Pakistanis basically say that Pakistani Muslims confronted Hindutva thugs in Leicester. The cowards ran away, and you see the evidence of violent instigation on social media. And it is to be noted that all three of these tweets have since been deleted. And in the days following the cricket match, these three tweets had the most engagement on a day-by-day basis before the first attacks of violence on September 4th. So, September 5th, sorry. So you see that this is a timeline of events that the NCRI has put together, starting with the cricket match, then the amplification of that video from Tragic Bud, then British Pakistani accounts portraying Hindus as a dangerous threat, calling for a response. September 5th, the mobs of British Pakistani men attack Hindu homes in Leicester, remove sacred flags and vandalize cars and property. And then you see September 6th, that's when both Hindu and Indian accounts come to know about this violence that has taken place and express outrage. Then September 7th, you see Riaz Khan, who has over 25,000 followers on Facebook, suggesting that it was the Hindutva RSS thugs that have been harassing Muslims for months, and this isn't about just the cricket match, this is about escalating tension. Then September 9th, Majid Freeman claiming that a Muslim man were approached and threatened with a knife by a Hindu gang, which is an unverified claim, and since the tweet has been deleted. And another thing that a lot of mainstream outlets have missed is actually instigation on YouTube, which is what the NCRI also collected. So looking at channels like Smile to Jannah, which had over 611,000 subscribers, with a video that had 128,000 views, warning the BJP not to mess with the Pakistani gangs in the UK, who is going to be pushing back against this alleged BJP and Hindutva threat. And then September 10th, there was a video where Hindu girls were dancing. We don't know the location of this, but Hindu girls were basically dancing for Navratri and Garba and suggesting that this is a provocation against Muslims. And you see like foul language being used in that video. And then comes September 12th. This is probably one of the most important malicious narratives. And Parth, I know you worked on this, so I'll give you this part after. But basically, these influencers disseminate misinformation about Hindu men kidnapping a Muslim girl, leading to doxing and threats against these Hindu men. Turns out that the kidnapping never actually took place. And then comes Dutch Raja on Instagram, who had over 150,000 followers, basically calling for basically Muslims to gather in an area of Birmingham, saying that we need to protect our Muslim and Sikh women, elderly, and children, and show these RSS extremists not to mess with our Muslims, and calling for them to go from Birmingham to Leicester on that weekend to, you know what's gonna come next. And then September 17th, Instagram accounts DOA Muslims and UK Apna Central, those usernames, UK Apna Central has since been changed, posting Instagram stories saying that Hindus have attacked a mosque, so you have to get down here, we have to act. Turns out, excuse me, that there was no mosques were actually attacked. And then on September 17th, you see the actual violence take place where Islamist mobs burn and remove a Hindu flag, vandalize temples, and also attack Hindus in Leicester. And meanwhile, Hindu mobs are basically gathering and chanting Jai Shri Ram, Ganapati Bappa Moria, and Vande Mataram, also throwing glass at the police. Then there was this malicious narrative where a supermarket in Birmingham had actually caught fire on that weekend, and there were Hindu accounts that were basically disseminating misinformation about, oh, look, the Muslims are attacking Hindus in Birmingham and setting their temples on fire, when in fact that never happened. Then on September 20th, you see that there was Indian accounts basically blaming Muslims for the violence, and there were some Islamophobic memes that were in circulation that also went viral. And September 19th, Mohammed Hijab actually arrives to Leicester for a Muslim patrol. He has more than 1 million followers, and in a very viral speech, he uses anti-Hindu slurs. And finally, September 20th, where a Hindu temple in Birmingham was surrounded by a mob of around 200 Muslim men, and an 18-year-old was arrested for knife possession. So on a high level, this is all of the events that took place and the related social media narratives.
Okay, wow. Thank you very much for actually going through that whole thing. I think that's a good breakdown of all the events that happened. So I think at one point you wanted to defer to Parth about a specific part of the misinformation, I think regarding the kidnapping of the young girl. So Parthji, would you like to go ahead and answer that?
Sure, absolutely. So, so the misinformation narrative that Prasiddha is referring to is a rumor that was started that 3 Hindu men had tried to kidnap a young Muslim schoolgirl, and that they were unsuccessful in the attempt. But a complaint was lodged by the family of the supposed victim, of the alleged victim. Now, upon further investigation, the police actually did publicly state that there were no charges that were going to be filed. Majid Freeman, who was himself very influential in spreading this rumor, also publicly stated, to his credit, that the incident in question never happened. But despite all of that, there was significant mobilization against the Hindu community. This is one of the examples that we talk about a lot in the report, because there was an emphasis, I think, from within the anti-Hindu disinformation narratives of portraying Muslims as victims of Hindu aggression, of Hindus as militant, of Hindus as extremist, and that any type of action, any type of mobilization was therefore justified. And you do see, in fact, from the Instagram account user Dutch Raja, who I think has over 250,000 followers on Instagram, he posts a Twitter poll which asks whether social media users would like to go down to Leicester and teach these Hindutva thugs a lesson, basically. And 95% of users respond affirmatively to that post. Dutch Raja then later organizes a bus and a movement of a convoy, I guess, of vehicles from Birmingham to Leicester to do exactly that, to confront these Hindutva thugs, in his words, that are, in his view, responsible. While that's happening, he also posts images of Hindu teenagers who he calls complicit in this incident. Keep in mind that by this time, the police and Freeman himself have clarified that this never happened. So this rumor starts on the 13th. They're about events that supposedly happened on the 12th. And this mobilization happens then the following day, and the actual real in-life events that the social media posts galvanizes happens on the 17th. Which is where you see actually a confrontation between the Muslim and the Hindu community in Leicester on Green Lane Road. So this is how we see very directly, this is a very clear case of a narrative that's whipped up on social media, is used to mobilize around, and then causes violence in the real world against a vulnerable community in this case. So that's one of the really important examples that we tried to really highlight and give texture to in the report. And there's a couple others that also come later that maybe we can talk about as we go on.
Yeah, actually, I think we could talk about some of those. One thing that you mentioned, which I think may lead me to my next question, is you mentioned that there was kind of an effort to paint the Muslims as victims in these narratives. And in your paper, I believe the natural language processing portion, you kind of touch on that. So can you kind of explain what that means? Like, what is natural language processing? And I was a little bit confused on what that actually meant, and how does that prove that there was an effort to actually paint Muslims as victims?
So what we did in terms of natural language processing was basically look at mentions of Hindu and Muslim in context of the Leicester violence. So can you see my screen?
Yep, it's up.
Okay, great. So what we did is we developed a topic network, the same that we did for our previous paper, which basically looks at the relationships and similarities between terms. So when you take up the word Muslim, what are the terms that are frequently associated with Muslim? You see that there are terms like largely, lone, hundreds, drunken, last night, allegedly, retaliation, group, protester, dissent. So you see that these are the terms frequently associated, and when we look at some real-world examples of tweets that mention these terms, you see that yes, they came in retaliation to the RSS extremists after they marched through predominantly Muslim areas of Leicester, causing havoc and assaulting people. And then another example, basically Hindus were attacking Muslims in Leicester, and in this clip, Muslims take revenge and destroy one of their cars. So you see that Muslims are basically depicted as retaliating to the violence in Leicester. Whereas when you look at the terms related to Hindu, you see terms like deliberately abuse, Leicester, emerge, rampage, terrorize, unleash, and again, drunken, Muslim, terrorize. So that whole cluster of drunken is more closely associated with Muslim than Hindu. But you see that Hindus are shown as like disproportionately violent, where these terms like terrorize, abuse, rampage, those are the terms frequently associated with the word Hindu. So those are the disparities between the terms Hindu and Muslim on Twitter.
Thank you very much. I think that gives a very good idea of what that actually means, natural language processing. Also, can you explain, there were some other terms in the paper that you had which covered your methodology. Can you kind of explain what some of those terms are?
Yeah, sure. Actually, one other thing with natural language processing that I actually think is important to highlight, and honestly, one of my favorite parts of the paper, we had an outstanding graduate student researcher work on this part, which is using Conflabert and Hatebert. So these two are also natural language processing methodologies, which basically are used to detect conflict and hate speech that has been trained on Twitter data. So this was run on this Leicester dataset. And what happened is basically it was flagging a certain number of tweets that were found as hateful. And then we used a human in the loop approach of manually going through those tweets and then identifying What kind of, was it incitement to violence, and if so, was it anti-Hindu or was it anti-Muslim? So you see that 70% of threats made overall on Twitter were actually against Hindus, and 30% were against Muslims. And actually, I'd like to share a example. So this is an example of tweets that were flagged as anti-Hindu. For example, Hindutva cowards, next time you target lone Pakistani and Muslim men, we won't let you go like last night. This isn't Uttar Pradesh. Here we will lynch you by your piss-drinking mouths. These are the types of slurs that were used on Twitter, and this is flagged by our models as incitement to violence. And then as an examples of anti-Muslim slurs that came up, you see things like, Leicester police, throw out these Islamic terrorists from your country, otherwise you will suffer. We Hindus have history of facing these Islamic terrorists for more than 800 years. If you can't control, give Hindus a free hand. We will send them to heaven, basically. Actually, it's another slur, but I'm not going to read it out loud. But this is the whole point, is that these are the types of slurs that are used both against Hindus and against Muslims, but our data shows that 70% was anti-Hindu and 30% was anti-Muslim.
So actually, that actually answers the question I was going to ask: was there a discrepancy between Islamophobia and Hinduphobia? So I think it's fair on your part that you actually did cover Islamophobia, but we do see that there is a discrepancy. So thank you for actually answering that. Parth, was there something you wanted to add to this?
Not too much. I think one thing that I would add is that there was a discrepancy, like you said, in terms of the volume. I think the other difference that we found was in terms of the geographic location of where some of this was coming from. So, for instance, when you looked at the anti-Hindu tweets, not necessarily the ones instigating violence, but just the ones that were, let's say, attributing blame to the Hindu community for the events in Leicester. About half of them were coming from within the UK, so it was pretty concentrated. Oh, sorry, I should actually reframe what I'm saying. So within the UK, about half the tweets were attributing blame to the Hindu community, and about half were attributing blame to the Muslim community. Whereas in India, that's really where we saw most of the anti-Muslim messaging coming from in terms of volume. And so, there's a discrepancy geographically in terms of who was closer to on the ground and who really, I guess you could say, which set of tweets you could say really had the potential to lead to real world events.
Okay. So I thank you for sharing that, by the way. I think that gives us another insight into the data. Um, so you also covered, I'm sorry, Prasiddha, did you want to say something? Apologize. Yes.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I want to actually show some of the methodology we used to come to that conclusion. So what we did is actually another process called sentiment analysis, where we used Google Jigsaw's Perspective API, and that gives you scores whether a tweet is toxic, insulting, has an identity attack, and threat. And what you see is that throughout this Leicester violence, the tweets with identity attacks were the ones that were really surging, followed by threats, and then insults, and then toxic tweets. So based on this data, what we did is manual classification of the locations. So whether there were cities, countries, all of that was manually segregated out from all of the accounts. And what you see, like Parth said, is roughly UK has equal blame on Hindus and Muslims, slightly more against Hindus, whereas tweets coming from India basically significantly blame Muslims in comparison to Hindus, or both or neither. And we basically repeated the same process for YouTube and TikTok data by looking at the number of views, views over 10,000, and for YouTube views TikTok views more than 20,000, and YouTube more than 10,000, just because there was so much data to collect everything, and basically repeated the same process. And we also took a look at YouTube comments on the videos that were preceding the violence. And what we do see is that in some of these cases, there were basically escalations in anti-Muslim rhetoric from some of the accounts coming from India. And we also looked at whether these tweets were removed by Twitter or kept up. So for example, this dehumanizing caricature of Muslims depicted as insects was actually removed by Twitter. And while this doesn't appear to have anything to do with the Leicester violence, you see that this is used with hashtag Hindus under attack in the UK. And there are other caricatures like portraying Muslims as like fear mongering about Muslims and talking about Islamic takeovers of the UK basically being used. And at the same time, there are also anti-Muslim, anti-Hindu messaging, basically portraying Hindus as violent and only Muslims as retaliating, like we see in our topic networks, but also OSINT that shows that it was Hindus that were instigating the violence, but now they're playing victim in front of all of the newspapers, and that's basically with this meme over here.
Okay. Now, is there a discrepancy in Islamophobic tweets being taken down versus Hindu-phobic tweets being taken down? Did your research cover that, or
So the thing is, we can't quantify that,
okay?
but just by eye, looking at some of the anti-Muslim messaging, some of it has been taken down. But when we look at the anti-Hindu messaging, none of it has been taken down. But I don't want to make claims because we didn't closely analyze it, and we can't quantify that either.
Okay, that's fair. Now, another thing you talked about in the research paper was you talked about certain bot accounts that were active. How much of a factor do you think the bots were in spreading misinformation?
Okay, so that's a really good question. Also, very important for us to understand. So bots, what we found is that there were bots both disseminating anti-Muslim rhetoric and also bots disseminating anti-Hindu rhetoric. So first, for our methodology of how we determined an account is a bot or not. For example, if a bot is tweeting like 100 times, 500 times, like per minute, you know that that is not an authentic user sitting behind the screen and is most likely a bot. What we also did is using Indiana University's botometer, basically running it through, which gives us scores on whether an account is a bot or not, to confirm our findings. And what we looked at first is looking at all of the accounts that were created between August 27th to September 19th. And what we see is that there are close to 500 inauthentic accounts like this that were created. So what you see is that there are bots amplifying anti-Muslim rhetoric, for example, saying things like, over the last 20 years, how many UK Hindus have been involved in terrorism? Zero, as far as I know. Over the last 20 years, how many UK Muslims have been involved in terrorism? Thousands. Large number of them have fought for Taliban, Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, #Leicester. And you see these types of messaging are repeated over and over and over again. This is like two examples that we've picked out of all of the other bots that we've identified. And the same is true for anti-Hindu rhetoric, of basically saying that it is these Hindutva terrorists that are trying to incite violence and mobilize a global genocide, and the same kind of messaging being repeated over and over and over again from accounts that have very recently been created throughout this Leicester episode. So this is what we've seen, is that the kind of spamming of the same messaging seems to be very active in throughout this Leicester issue.
So, from my understanding of what you just explained, the bots pretty much what this means is there's somebody out there in bad faith spreading misinformation. They pretty much program these bots to tweet out like 500 tweets in a second intentionally to spread misinformation. Is that how it works?
Right. So what we've seen from these bots is mostly coordinated inauthentic activity of spamming the same message over and over again that contains both anti-Hindu and anti-Muslim rhetoric.
And you have a tool, I think you call it a botometer or something, which you use.
Yeah, so that's by Indiana University. They have an open source tool that can identify whether an account is a bot or not.
And how much of a factor actually do you think it played compared to maybe people with big platforms spreading misinformation?
It's a really good question, and honestly, something I don't feel like we can properly assess.
Okay.
Just because we need to examine the bots more closely in terms of looking at what dates were they spreading these types of messaging and quantifying how many bots were anti-Hindu versus anti-Muslim, something that we actually haven't done. So it's not possible to say in the current scope of the research, but it is certainly possible with more investigation and research into the bot accounts.
Okay. So yeah, it's hard to quantify right now, but definitely. So now another thing I want to talk about is the more popular social media handles, and I think you mentioned, I think his name is Masjid Freeman and Muhammad Hijab, and now these are very popular people online. Like I think even people like Andrew Tate had him on as guests, and it's kind of crazy that how are these guys getting away with being so anti-Hindu and sort of still maintaining their following? Like, when I think it's kind of difficult for people to be so like racist or intolerant without having a lot of pushback from the public. So, do you have any insight on how that's happening?
That's a really good question. So I think if you look at the way I'll speak to, I guess, Majid Freeman. So if you look at the way that Majid Freeman was framing what he was saying, he wasn't anti-Hindu, he was anti-Hindutva.
Okay, so it's seen as like
And
a legitimate political criticism versus.
well, it's political criticism, and it's also warning against the violence that will be perpetrated by members of the Hindu diaspora that are extremists. So there's this kind of idea that's kind of self-confirming, right? That there are people within the Hindu diaspora that are committing this violence, and therefore we must retaliate against them to make sure that this violence doesn't happen again. And this is actually what causes the violence to take place in the first place, this idea. I think there's very little understanding in general about the fact that a lot of times this type of blame is laid at the Hindu community just for representing its own interests, the same way that other communities, like for example the Jewish community, would have people being called Zionists for not really doing anything except for talking about anti-Semitism or just simply practicing their faith. A similar thing would happen to Hindus. In one case, for example, a Hindu mandir, which is, I think, the Sri Sanatana Hindu Mandir on Ealing Road, I believe, was accused of being the hornet's nest of Nazi Hindutva. So you see that this type of blame of, community members, but then also centers of the community, right? Places of worship being labeled as being responsible for fomenting violence is something that happens. And because you're not specifically speaking against the whole community, you're using language that's coded to suggest that these are people who are extremists or people, as you said, who have a certain political ideology, that type of speech kind of goes kind of unfiltered. There was also another narrative kind of continuing on the same kind of idea of vilifying institutions, Hindu institutions, as kind of being centers for breeding this type of violence, where one of the Hindu mandirs, again, was blamed for busing members, devotees of that temple to a mosque in Birmingham to attack that mosque. Neither was that mosque actually attacked. Again, the police confirmed that this attack never happened. And neither is it true that mandir organized any type of buses, angel tour buses, to bring devotees actually to that mosque. This was confirmed by the owner of that angel tours bus company, who actually himself was Muslim. So these types of narratives were spread, and I think we have to be careful, right? Because the language that's being used is often blaming Hindutva, RSS, thugs, etc., etc., etc. But that type of blame attribution is always laid at just normal, regular Hindu people. And this is a type of trope and a type of way of getting around people seeing things as bigoted that people of all shapes, sizes, communities, etc., have been employing against the Hindu community.
So, actually, Prasiddha, do you want to share something on the screen? I think you just pulled something up.
No, yeah, I had just shared the examples that Parth was talking
Okay.
about of this idea that Hindus were bussing in people. That's completely untrue and also actually projection, because what we see is that actual Dutch Raja, meanwhile, is posting pictures in his car saying, "Hey lads, I'll see you later," on the day of the violence that has been captured from his Instagram story by several people doing OSINT online, which we leveraged very heavily. So thank you to all of those people who we've cited. And what we see is its projection because actual people associated with Dutch Raja are coming in.
So, okay, so it's actually the opposite of what's being projected. That's crazy. So now there's something I remember in the previous interview I did where I was talking about the Leicester riots. One of the points that came up was, by the time a lot of times the incidents happen, and right off the bat, people are very quick to want to push whatever narrative they want to push. A bunch of misinformation goes, and then in that time period, the narrative is already created, and often we're sort of trying to catch up to correcting everybody, but it's almost a little seems like it's too little, too late. How do we kind of do that without? But at the same time, we have to wait for all the facts to come out, right? So we can't just assume anything. So we're kind of stuck in this weird thing where how do we balance both of these? where we don't want to just run with any narrative. We got to wait for the facts to come out, but in the meantime, there's already narratives being created that we have to counter.
That's a really good question. Actually, Parth, you can answer first, then I'll go after you.
No, I think it's a good question. In economics, we have this idea of herding, which is that when someone speaks first, their opinion actually matters more because people want to get things right. So when someone reveals something about the state of the world, about what they think is going on, people then also question their own beliefs, and they may be more inclined to just agree with what the first person said. And I think you definitely see that a lot in also reporting in the news. It's not the case that, journalists are also human. They are also subject to the same natural human impulses and incentives that we all are. So I think we have to kind of dispense with that idea, just like at the outset. I think in terms of like, what can we do to solve this problem of the narrative being set already, of people's attention being kind of already in one direction and looking for stories in that direction. I think it's a really hard problem to solve. I would suggest that now that this report is out, now that people kind of are more aware about what exactly happened, there needs to be an actual reckoning with everyone who was a responsible actor and was still going with a lot of the debunked narratives, the narratives that are now debunked. The narratives that at the time were taken at face value.
Yeah.
I think there needs to be kind of an understanding of how this happened. There needs to be a post-mortem of how this could happen. And there needs to be a good faith effort to try to make sure that that doesn't happen again. At the end of the day, we have to believe that journalism, journalism is there for the public interest. And, in cases, if it's not serving the public interest, there's an absolute legitimate reason and a legitimate interest in ensuring that those processes are improved. So that we can, when something, again, inevitably something like this was going to happen again between two communities. It may not be the Hindu and Muslim community, maybe two other communities, but regardless of who it happens to, it's really important for journalists to actually be attuned to the truth and not attuned to their preconceived notions about what's happening or be too quick to jump in and weigh in on a subject.
If only they weren't incentivized to do so. You know what I mean? It's difficult. Prasiddha ji, did you want to answer anything?
Yeah, so I think that's a great point, Parth. I think I want to take a different approach to this answer through the lens of computer science. So in CS and in machine learning in general, there are methods that we can use called anomaly detection, so that anything that's kind of an outlier in the data and being able to actually detect that. So you see, I want to give this example because the mentions of the terms associated with cow piss were actually at an all-time high around September 18th, 19th, basically double of what it was previously. And what you see is that on the 20th of September, there was an actual Islamist mob that had gathered around a Hindu temple in Birmingham with screams of "go drink some cow beep" and then "go eat some cow."
Right.
So what I'm trying to say is that you see that this is actually, these tropes that we've identified online are actually taking place in the kinetic world. So, and police obviously arrested someone for having a knife at this event. So we actually did the same process. The NCRI did a research report on the usage of the N slur right after Elon Musk's takeover, where we found racist raids originating from 4chan, basically coming back onto Twitter and spamming the N word. And we were able to detect that using anomaly detection methods. There's actually a piece in NBC, I'm happy to link that for you, that you can add to the description. But the point is that we need to start using these types of methodologies and real-time tools to monitor social media and look at the kind of tropes that can be used against any and all communities to make sure that the action is preventative and not something that comes after the violence has taken place.
Okay. Thank you very much for sharing that. So now, I want to talk about what you mentioned in the conclusion, right? So, the main conclusion in the paper is that the violence that occurred was due to social media misinformation and not because of organic outrage. And I think is it safe to say that maybe if it wasn't for the social media misinformation, it may have just been like a small skirmish between cricket fans, the same way you have certain violence with soccer hooligans or other things like that. It may have just been like a small story, but because of the misinformation, it got turned into a much bigger thing.
Yeah, I mean, so it's hard to construct counterfactuals about what would have happened if social media
Right,
didn't
right.
exist, how people would have communicated, because there are still ways of spreading these types of rumors, especially when communities are highly concentrated in certain areas. Communities tend to live within certain parameters. This is true of every community, right? There's homophily. So, but I would say that what this paper demonstrates very clearly is that social media was used as a weapon here. And I think it is reasonable to infer that narratives would not have spread as quickly because social media, at the end of the day, it's instantaneous. People see things very, very quickly. I think that it's reasonable to infer that things may not have spread as quickly as they did in this case.
Okay. And Prasiddha ji, would you like to add something?
Yeah, and I think the problem really is that many of these malicious narratives were actually deleted from the internet or also, expired after 24 hours, like Instagram stories, for instance. And so basically, law enforcement and others and government authorities really need to take note of when someone with over 150,000 followers is saying, we need to go show a community who is boss and actually put down addresses of where they're going to meet, what they're going to be doing, and it's very clear out there. These kind of protective measures need to be taken because this is, using open source intelligence. It's not like evading someone's privacy. This is all out there on the internet. So law enforcement need to, really be aware of the types of cyber swarming that's being used online to harm vulnerable communities and also build on interfaith dialogue between communities to know that the one community needs to understand the other and kind of have respectful dialogue about each other's perspectives and how their own community operates. We need to have more of that for preventative action. And finally, just before the release of this report, Rishi Sunak became the prime minister. So you see that these conspiracies about Hindutva have the propensity to get worse. And that's what we're warning here. It's actually, I believe, in The Guardian, there was actually a report from The Guardian that said that conspiracies about being a globalist actually increased once Rishi Sunak became prime minister. That's standard anti-Semitism. But now you see it being used against the Hindu community. So we just need to be aware of this, that this can also, be a serious implication for the Hindu community living in the UK.
Thank you very much for that. So actually, I wanted to also talk about, because you mentioned The Guardian and a few other outlets. What role did mainstream media play in spreading misinformation? I think you covered that a little bit in the paper as well. Do you want to quickly talk about that?
I think the biggest issue is just not doing due diligence on the people that they were referring to and quoting. So, what we noted is that BBC, The Guardian, and the New York Times, I'm sure there could be other outlets that also quoted from Majid Freeman without doing due diligence about Majid Freeman's prior comments. I think that's the biggest issue is not doing due diligence in platforming someone who actually was a central agitator throughout this Leicester violence.
Okay.
The only thing I would add is that specific examples of media outlets amplifying and republishing some of the social media misinformation narratives that we saw. So one was I think actually both of them concerned the alleged attack on the Birmingham mosque, which again the police clarified never happened. So both Al Jazeera Arabic actually posted a video about that incident, which I don't know where they got this video from since nothing happened, but they posted a video that claimed that this was an attack on the mosque in Birmingham.
Okay.
And another outlet, The Wire, which is an Indian outlet, of course, they also I guess amplified the idea that the Angel Tours buses were organized from a Hindu mandir in Leicester to bus people to attack this mosque. So you see that these narratives, they did actually percolate to two outlets which one could call mainstream. They're outlets that are consumed by a wide range of people.
Okay, thank you. So now I guess my final sort of question would be, do you have any closing remarks and message that you want people to get after they read this paper? What do you think Hindus should be kind of wary of? What should we be aware of?
I think the biggest takeaway from me is that Hindus need to take more care in terms of building community protection and building relationships with law enforcement in the same way that every community does. This isn't specific to Hindus by any means, but making sure that temples are adequately protected, that Hindu communities are protected, and aware of like the social media narratives that are going on that can cause harm to the communities is that really building those relationships is key here. And even though you see that the Leicester Police Handle were actively responding, talking about how there weren't like mosque attacks, for instance, or others, and actively debunking misinformation online, you see that the issue is kind of like what I already talked about. So I really think that Hindu communities should invest in their own protection. That's really key here.
Okay. Pochi?
No, I would really just echo what Prasiddha said. I think there's also a room here to educate others, educate all the stakeholders that we've talked about. So, Prasiddha mentioned law enforcement. I think that's a really important one. I think also educating other communities on what's going on. I think there's a lot of what the work that the NCRI brings to light is that there's a lot of shared experiences here that all vulnerable communities face, especially diasporic communities face. And so there's a lot of room for dialogue, and there's a lot of room for sharing experiences across communities. And I do think that the Hindu community diasporically tends to be a little bit more reticent in doing these types of interactions. I think that's really important if at the end of the day we want our narratives, we want the types of attacks that happen in this case to be brought to light. So I think that those are lessons for the Hindu community to take away from this report.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that. So on that note, I think we will close this interview. I want to thank you guys very much for joining the show today. I think the work you do is incredible. And you know what? To the audience, if you want to support this work, please follow them on social media, like, share, comment, and stay tuned. Thank you very much. Namaste. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Namaste.
Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.